Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and thank you so much for watching. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this Harry Potter themed cake. I am a huge Harry Potter fan, so I was super happy to make this. This is a longer video, so if you don't want to watch the whole thing, I have time-stamped how I made each piece below, so if you want to skip through, you can. Thank you so much, and let's get right into it. I'm going to start off by making Harry's uniform, and to do this, I have two 6-inch cakes that I've cut in half, and I'm going to be filling those with Swiss meringue buttercream and some chopped up mini eggs. I'm using my small offset spatula to make sure my buttercream and my filling are nice and even, and once my cake is stacked up, I'm going to add a thin layer of that buttercream all the way around to lock in the crumbs. I've placed that in the fridge for about 25 minutes, and now I'm going to apply my final ice. I'm applying a thick layer of my buttercream all the way around my cake, and I'm using my bench scraper to smooth the sides, and then all that buttercream that's built up along the top, I'm going to take my spatula and just drag that into the middle. I'm placing that back in the fridge to chill and then rolling out some white fondant on my cornstarch surface about 1/8 of an inch thick, and I'm going to pick that up with my fondant roller and drape it over my cake, and then just using my hands and my fondant smoother, I'm going to push all that air out from the top and just work my way down, pulling out the skirt of fondant and smoothing the sides until I reach the bottom. I'm going to go over my entire cake one more time with my fondant smoother, and then using my pizza cutter or a sharp knife, I'm just going to trim away all that excess on the bottom of my cake. Next, I'm going to roll out some gray fondant for Harry's sweater, and I'm going to lightly push that against the front of my cake, and I'm going to trim away like a rectangle shape, and from that rectangle shape, I'm going to cut a V, and then just peel away all the excess. And it doesn't have to be perfect because the sides of this are going to be covered, so don't worry about getting it symmetrical. Just make sure that you have a nice V shape with enough space for his little tie. I'm going to add the trim to his sweater, so I'm rolling out some yellow fondant and some dark, kind of maroon colored fondant, a darker red, and I'm cutting those into long strips, and then I'm just creating the little design on the front of his sweater. For his tie, I'm taking more of my dark red color and shaping it into this teardrop shape, and then I'm flattening that against my surface and just cutting off the end so it's pointed and it's going to fit right into the middle of my V. and then taking another smaller piece and rolling it out to be like a chubby square, just this pudgy little shape. And then I'm fitting that right on top, but I'm gonna add the collar of my shirt, so I'm not gonna stick that on there just yet. I'm just making sure it's the right size. To make my collar, I'm adding some Tylose powder to some white fondant to make sure that's gonna set really firm, and I'm just gonna cut that into a strip. I wrapped that thick strip around a can of soup just to help it get that round shape, and I just let it firm up for a couple minutes. I rolled out some more of my white fondant that I haven't added any Tylose powder to, and I'm going to cut that out into a longer and thicker strip than I did for my initial collar piece. I'm placing the piece that I added Tylose powder to on top of that, and then I'm going to trim the sides of my bigger piece and fold it over. Then I'm going to flip it up and rearrange it in that circular shape that I want, and then I just flipped out the very fronts to make it look more like a shirt collar. I placed that on top of my cake and added my tie piece and just made sure it kind of tucked into the collar a bit. To finish off the tie, I rolled out some more of my yellow fondant and cut some thin strips, and then just arranged those for the stripes on his tie. I added this to a board that I already decorated, and if you want to see how to add the stone effect to a board, I will link the video below. It's not mine, but it's Zoe's Fancy Cakes, and it's a really great tutorial, so you should check it out. To add his robes, I rolled out some pieces of black fondant and just arranged them to kind of make it look like they're flowing off of his shoulders. Just monkey around with it until you get the right look that you want. And then I rolled out more of my dark red fondant and added the trim on either side. Next, I'm going to make my cauldron, and to do this, I baked off one 4-inch cake and one 5-inch cake, and then I cut those both in half. And starting with the 4-inch cake for the bottom, I'm filling these with some Swiss meringue buttercream that I added some crushed up Oreos to. And on top of that, I'm adding my 2 5-inch cakes and then my last 4-inch cake on the top. I decided that my 4-inch cakes were just a little bit too thick, so I cut the top in half and then I flipped it over and cut the bottom piece in half. Then I'm taking a circle cutter that's just a little bit smaller than my 4-inch cake, and I'm placing that right in the center and marking that in, and that's going to be a guide as I'm carving my cake. Using the marking that I just made, I'm going to start cutting the edges off my cake and just rounding them out, and then I'm going to flip it over and do the exact same thing on the bottom. Just go slow with this and make smaller cuts versus bigger ones. It's a lot easier to take more away than it is to put it back, and just work slowly to round out all the edges of your cake until you have this cauldron-y shape. Once I'm happy with it, I added a crumb coat, so just a thin layer of my Swiss meringue buttercream all the way around, and then I popped that into the fridge for about 25 minutes. Once it's chilled, I'm going to add my final ice, so a nice thick layer of buttercream all the way around. And then to smooth out the edges, I'm going to be using a piece of cardstock because you can kind of bend it to fit the cake. And I'm going to make sure all my sides are smooth. and then using my spatula, just bring all that buttercream that built up along the edge and just drag it into the middle. Next, I'm going to roll out my black fondant, and then I'm going to drape that over my cauldron, and I worked really quickly to smooth out the top and the bottom, and because it's a spherical cake, it's a little trickier, so I trimmed away some of that excess fondant around the bottom, and then I flipped my cake over and tucked that fondant over onto the board, and I do have a couple creases, but that's okay. So once everything was smoothed out, I took a sharp knife and then just used the board as a guide to trim away all the excess left at the bottom. For the lip on my cauldron, I'm rolling out some more black fondant into a long snake shape, and then just using some water, I'm going to attach that along the top. And I want to deepen that black color, so I've mixed some food gel with some food grade alcohol, and I'm going to paint my entire cauldron, and this just gives it a little more dimension versus that flat black color. To create the contents of my cauldron, I've dyed some fondant a bright green color, and I'm rolling out a bunch of different size balls and placing that all over the top of my cauldron. To give it more of a slimy effect, I'm going to make some ganache. So I'm mixing together equal parts white chocolate and heavy cream, and I'm going to put that in the microwave for 20-second intervals and just mix it until it's completely melted. I'm going to set that aside to cool down a bit for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to add some more of my green food coloring to that. Once I know it's cooled down and it won't melt my fondant, I'm going to spoon that over and make sure all of my balls are covered so it looks like a bubbling brew. For my butterbeer mug, I cut out 4 circles of cake using my circle cutter, and you can use whatever size you want depending on how big you want your mug to be. And then I stacked those up with some vanilla buttercream. Once my cake was stacked up, I added a thin layer of my buttercream all on the outside for my crumb coat, and it can be a little tricky to ice these smaller cakes, just have a little bit of patience. So once my crumb coat was on there, I put that in the fridge, and after 25 minutes, I added my final ice, and then again just used my bench scraper to smooth the edges, and my small spatula to smooth the top. I've rolled out some gray fondant for my mug, and I found the easiest way to do this was to place my cake right on top of my fondant, and I just cut a nice straight seam and folded that over, and then I just rolled my cake up, and where it was going to meet the fondant again, I just cut that and made sure that both of those sides met up and joined together so that you couldn't see any of the buttercream. I don't recommend doing this if you're making a larger cake, but because mine was so small, the cake wasn't really affected by being turned on its side like that. For the handle on my butterbeer mug, I added some Tylose powder to more of my gray fondant, and then I rolled it out into a long snake and just shaped it into this little handle, and I added some toothpicks so that it would insert into the cake. And just make sure that you tell people that there are some toothpicks in there. You could also use some spaghetti if you want it to be completely edible. Once my handle was dry, I just inserted that right into the side of my cake. Next, I took some Super Silver Luster Dust by Rollcom, and I used a paintbrush to buff that onto my mug. I covered the entire mug and the handle with a thin layer of shortening just because it helps the luster dust to adhere better, and I made sure the entire thing was covered so it had more of a metallic effect. So it ends up looking like this, and the last thing I did to my mug was pipe on some whipping cream to the top, but you will see that closer to the end of the video. I'm making Tom Riddle's diary for my cake because that's one of my favorite parts. So to do that, I have this small 6-inch square of cake, and I'm going to trim off one side of that to make my book a little more elongated. And I'm going to take that offcut and add it to the top to give my book a little more height. And I'm just going to trim away the side so that it looks like a rectangle. I cut that in half and then added some Swiss meringue buttercream in the middle. And then just like my other cakes, I'm going to add my thin layer buttercream for my crumb coat and pop that in the fridge for 25 minutes. And then I'm going to add my final ice and use my spatula and my bench scraper to smooth it out. For the pages in my book, I'm rolling out a long strip of white fondant and then putting that on 3 sides. My camera didn't show this part, but to make the pages look like pages, I took a knife and just scored in a bunch of lines along all 3 sides. Next, you want to roll out some black fondant, and then I placed my book right on top of that and trimmed away the sides. You want to make sure that you have a little bit of a lip on every part of that book, so don't trim it right flush against that white. Make sure there's a little bit of a gap. Then I folded that black over the top and I just cut away the front so that it wasn't overhanging too much. Tom's diary has stitching going along the edges of the book, so I'm using my X-Acto knife here because I couldn't find my stitching tool, so I took the long way around. So you can either do it this way, or if you have a stitching tool, that'll be a lot faster. For the embellishments on the corner of the book, I just rolled out some pale yellow fondant and then cut out this kind of scallop design and attached that using some water. For the middle of the book, where Nagini's fang punctures the top, I used my small fondant roller and just marked in that circle, and then used my X-Acto knife and my sculpting tools just to kind of mash it up and mark it up a bit so it didn't look so pretty and perfect. If you press a little too hard like I did and break through the fondant to the buttercream, you can just add a little more black fondant and just mush that down. Before I painted my scalloped bits gold, I used my fondant tool and marked in 3 circle indents, and then I mixed some gold luster dust with some food grade alcohol and painted those. To make my Bertie Botts box, I used 2 6-inch cakes that I cut in half, and I stacked those together with some Swiss meringue buttercream that I added some crushed Oreos to. And I carved that into a rectangle shape at first, but I wanted to taper off one end, so one end's a little bit skinnier and one end is a little more fat. I did one final crumb coat out of all these cakes, and then I put that in the fridge for 25 minutes, popped it out, added my final ice, and then smoothed everything out using my bench scraper and my small spatula. I rolled out a really pale yellow fondant and draped that over my iced Bertie Botts box and smoothed that out using my fondant smoother and my hands, and then just trimmed away that excess using my pizza cutter. To make it look like my box was opening, I took some more of my pale yellow fondant and added some Tylose powder to that. And then I cut out 2 longer rectangles and 2 shorter rectangles to be the top, bottom, and side pieces. To decorate the box, I rolled out some red fondant and cut that into some long strips, and then just spaced those evenly over the top and the sides of the box. Once the pieces I cut for the opening of my box were completely dry, I placed them on the front of my cake using some piping gel to secure them. And then I cut out one more long piece of red fondant and put that down over the seam where the pieces met the cake. I made the label with some white strips of fondant that I just drew on using an edible food marker. And then I had a bunch of jelly beans that I put spilling out of the box using some piping gel to keep them from slipping all over the place. Now that all of the other cakes are done, I'm going to show you how I made some of the decorative pieces. For Harry's wand, I used some brown fondant that I added some Tylose powder to, and I rolled it out into a long strip. And before it could set, I just used my fondant tool to mark in some indents so it looked a little bit roughed up like a real piece of wood. Once it is completely dry, make sure you handle it very carefully so it doesn't break. I added another piece of brown fondant to the end of my wand and just wrapped it around for the handle. I just kind of mushed that around to make it look a little gnarly and knobbled up, and I used my fondant tool again to put some markings on it. And finally, once it completely dried, I took some black and brown color dust with a fluffy brush and just brushed that all over, making it look like it was a little more textured, and I put the black in all those little nooks and crannies so it looked really old. To go along with Tom's diary, I'm making Nagini's Fang. So I added some Tylose powder to some white fondant, and I rolled it out into this long teardrop shape with a super sharp end that's kind of curved a little bit. And then using my fingers, I just pulled on the top of that fat end to make it look like it came right out of her mouth. And using my fondant tool, I marked in some lines and some indents just to give it a little more texture so it's not perfectly smooth. Once that had dried, I took some black color dust and brushed that all over, making it darker towards the fatter end of the fang. To make my snitch, I rolled out a ball of light yellow fondant and I added a little bit of Tylose powder to this, and I let that set up before I tried to add any more of the detailing. While that was setting up, I wanted to cut out my wings. So I rolled out some pale yellow fondant and then just eyeballed the shape roughly and made sure they were both the same size. I used 2 pieces of floral wire, and I wanted to make sure that they entered the wing, if that made sense, on the point, but I didn't want it to run through the center. I wanted it to run a little bit lower on one side so that I could fold that wing over onto itself, and I had some room to cut in the texture without cutting through the wire. That probably made 0 sense, but hopefully watching me do it will explain it better. I used my X-Acto knife to cut in the texture, and again I was just really careful not to cut too high up so I exposed that wire. Do the same to the other wing and then set those both aside to firm up, and bring that ball of fondant back here. And I put a skewer into the bottom of that to help me get the details on there better without handling the ball too much. And I just made sure it was going in on the point of the stitch where it would be the bottom, so when I placed it on the cake you wouldn't see that hole I just made. I looked at a ton of different pictures and they all looked a little bit different, so I kind of just made up the design as I went. I did the best to match it to what I thought I saw, but just do your best. Once you paint it gold, you can't really tell. It looks awesome anyway. Once all the pieces of my Snitch had completely dried, I mixed together some food grade alcohol with some gold luster dust and painted the entire thing. Then I just carefully inserted both of those wings into the stitch. I find that it helped if you press the wire in a little bit, and then I used a pair of scissors to gently grip that wire and just push it in. It keeps you from mushing up the wings too much with your fingers. And finally, to make the chocolate egg, I melted down some white chocolate and I had this little mold here. So what I did was added the chocolate into the mold and made sure it covered all the sides, and then I just tipped that mold upside down to shake out any of that extra chocolate, and I flipped it back over and used my spatula to clean up the sides, and I let that set, and I did the exact same thing one more time to make sure my egg was nice and thick and it wouldn't crack. And then I put that in the freezer to set, and that cold makes the chocolate pull away from the mold a bit. So after about 10 minutes, I took that out of the freezer, flipped it upside down, and they should pop right out. To help the sides stick together, I heated up my bench scraper under some really hot water, and then I wiped away any excess water and just placed the egg on top of that and mushed it around until the chocolate melted a bit, and then pressed those sides together. For the details, I rolled out some pale yellow fondant, and I used a leaf cutter to cut out 4 leaves. You don't have to use a leaf cutter, you can just cut out these long triangular shapes, and I arranged those on the top and added a little ball of fondant to go on top of those, and then I brushed the entire egg with a little bit of shortening and added some luster dust just dry. I found that it looked a lot better versus trying to paint it on with the food grade alcohol because it was a little less streaky. And then you're done! If you watched this entire video and made it all the way to the end, you're absolutely amazing. I know it was really long, so I hope you stuck with me. You can see that I added some glasses, and there are tons of tutorials out there to show you how I made these. It was really easy. I just didn't want to make this video any longer. And I also added a little bit of parchment by the golden egg that said Harry Potter, and I just used white fondant for that, and I dusted it with some black and kind of tore the edges a bit to make it look a little burnt. But this was the final result. I hope you like it. I love this cake. I'm going to Harry Potter World this month for my birthday, so this just made me super happy. Thank you so much again, and I will see you in the next video.